Right now, I'm using about $3,400 of margin on a $40,000 portfolio, and I'm pretty comfortable with that. But the next big market drop is when I actually want to use more margin. The problem is when the market falls, my leverage can increase before I borrow another dollar. So I'm trying to figure this out now. When that drop comes, how much more risk will I actually have room to take? I found a number that can help me look at that, and that is the loan to value ratio. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Ricky on Margin. My name is Susan, and I am documenting my journey of being fully invested in growth ETFs while using margin. I'm still learning as I go. And if you're someone who's also learning as you go, if you're curious about margin, or if you just want to follow my journey as I figure all of this out, you're in the right place. I do want to give a quick disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not a financial expert in any way, shape, or form. I'm simply documenting what I'm doing with my own money and sharing some of the things I'm learning along the way. I also want to give a shout out to Mike from Recycle Your Money. He's the blueprint for this investing strategy that I'm using. He has a Discord, he has books, and a lot of other resources around this strategy. I'll leave a link to his channel so that you guys can check it out. So with that being said, let's start with the loan to value ratio. If you're a beginner like me, the loan to value ratio may not have been something you heard about before using margin. The calculation I'm using is pretty simple, and it is my margin balance divided by my portfolio value. Right now, my portfolio is around $40,000, and I'm using around $3,400 of margin. $3,400 divided by 40,000 gives me a loan to value ratio of about 8.5%. For me, the point isn't necessarily whether 8.5% is good or bad. I'm using the loan to value ratio to give that $3,400 margin balance some context, because the $3,400 of margin means something very different in a $10,000 portfolio than it does in a $100,000 portfolio. The amount borrowed could be exactly the same, but the amount of leverage relative to the portfolio would be very different. So the loan to value ratio helps me answer, how leveraged am I right now? And this becomes especially important once the market starts moving. Before using this strategy, I mainly thought leverage increased when you borrowed more money, but leverage can also increase because your portfolio loses value. Let's use my account as an example. If my $40,000 portfolio falls 10%, it becomes about $36,000. My margin balance is still $3,400. That increases my loan to value ratio from 8.5% to about 9.4%. I didn't borrow anything else, and my leverage increased because my portfolio decreased. Now let's say the market falls 20%. My portfolio falls to about $32,000. My margin balance is still $3,400, but now my loan to value ratio would be about 10.6%. And this is where the loan to value ratio becomes especially useful for what I'm actually trying to do. If I use more margin during a market drop, I'm not planning to take that money out of Robinhood and spend it. I'm planning to reinvest it back into my brokerage account. So now let's stay with that 20% market decline example, right? Let's say I decided to capitalize on that drop and use another $2,000 of margin. I reinvest that $2,000 back into the market. My margin balance will then increase from $3,400 to $5,400. And because I invested that $2,000, my invested value increases from about $32,000 to $34,000. So that puts my loan to value ratio at about 15.9%. So now I'm not just looking at the fact that I borrowed another $2,000. I can see what that additional borrowing did to my overall leverage. And those new investments can also contribute to my margin buying power. Right now, Robinhood is showing me I have $37,616 of available buying power. So let's use my actual buying power as the starting point. Let's say the market has already fallen 20% and I decide to take another $2,000 of margin and invest it. Before Robinhood recalculates anything, my buying power would drop from about $37,616 to $35,616. Then I reinvest that $2,000 back into my portfolio. Because I'm buying investments that can contribute to my margin buying power, Robinhood Robinhood may recalculate my account and give me some of that buying power back. So just for this example, let's say my buying power increases back to around $36,616. That number is only an approximation. My actual buying power would depend on what I buy, the margin requirements on those investments, and what Robinhood calculates at that time. But my margin debt is still there. At this point, my margin balance has increased from $3,400 to about $5,400, and my invested value has increased from about $32,000 to about $34,000. That puts my loan to value ratio at about 15.9%. Now imagine Robinhood is still showing me roughly $36,616 of buying power. I decide to use another $2,000. My buying power would initially fall to around $34,616. Then I reinvest that $2,000 back into the market. Robinhood would recalculate again. And for this example, let's say my buying power comes back up to around $35,616. Again, that buying power number is only an approximation. But now my margin balance has increased from $5,400 to $7,400. And my invested value has increased from $34,000 to $36,000. That puts my loan to value ratio at about 20.6%. So let's take a look at what happened here, right? I started with $37,616 of buying power. I borrowed money, my buying power dropped, and I reinvested that money back into my Robinhood account. Robinhood then recalculated my account and increased some of my buying power. I was then able to repeat that process. But keep in mind, every time I did that, my margin debt was still increasing. My loan to value ratio went from about 8.5% to 10.6% after the market fell. And it went to 15.9% after adding the first $2,000 of margin, and then to 20.6% after adding another $2,000 of margin. So even if Robinhood continues showing me a large amount of buying power, that doesn't mean my leverage stayed the same. That's why I'm starting to think of the loan to value ratio as my personal risk gauge. Buying power tells me how much Robinhood may still allow me to borrow, and the loan to value ratio tells me how leveraged I've actually become. Right now, I pay my margin balance off in full every paycheck, but that will change during a larger market drop. When that happens, I plan to intentionally carry more margin than I can pay back in a single pay period. And while the market is still declining, my plan is to continue to slowly add margin and dollar cost average it into the market. Once the S&P gets back to less than 10% of its all-time high, I plan to start using some of my cash flow to slowly pay that margin balance back down. So yeah, this is still a work in progress for me. Nothing here is set in stone. I'm just trying to put together a game plan for what I want to do when the next market drop happens. If this is something you guys are interested in following, please subscribe, please like, and I'll keep you guys updated as I continue putting that plan together. And if you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. Seriously, I really appreciate all the support you guys have been giving me, all the comments, all the likes, everything. I don't know everything, and I feel like there's a lot of people who are in a similar position where we want to improve our financial situation and we want to invest, but there's like so much to learn. So I wanted to document that process from the perspective of someone who's still figuring it out. Hopefully that gives other beginners another perspective while they're also learning from more advanced investors who are farther along. So yeah, I really appreciate it. I'm wishing you guys the best on your financial journey. I'm wishing you guys the best on achieving financial freedom and financial success. And I will talk to you guys later. Bye.